All right, so we got a really interesting question from a listener.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they were wondering if it's okay to get a haircut while you're doing like a religious fast.
Huh.
And I thought that was kind of like on the surface, it seems like pretty simple.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you start thinking about it, it's like, well,
That gets complicated.
yeah, it really does get kind of complicated because you've got
Yeah.
all these different faiths with all these,
Different traditions
different
and
traditions. Exactly.
different interpretations and
Yeah. So we're going to dive into that today.
awesome.
We're going to look at Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism and see what they have to say about it.
That's a great lineup.
We've got some religious texts, we've got some scholarly interpretations, and we're even going to look at some, like common practices and stuff like that. So,
Cool.
yeah, it's going to be a cool deep dive.
I think it's so interesting how, we're going to be comparing like internal spiritual practices with like
Like the outward stuff.
the really outward stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So let's kick things off with Islam.
Okay, great.
What do they say about haircuts and fasting?
So in Islam, especially during Ramadan, like the big month of fasting, generally getting a haircut is not gonna break your fast.
Really?
Yeah, it's not considered one of those things like eating or drinking.
Huh.
It's kind of interesting because even like showering using perfume,
Those are okay.
generally considered okay.
Wow.
Yeah, and there are even some interpretations that caution against like swallowing a hair during a haircut.
So they're really focused on...
What goes in your mouth?
Yeah.
Which kind of implies that the haircut itself is fine.
So the act of getting a haircut isn't the issue. It's just
Right.
like if you accidentally ingest something.
Exactly.
Okay, that's interesting.
But there are some nuances here.
Okay.
It's not just about breaking the fast.
Okay.
Some scholars believe that even though something might not technically break your fast,
Uh-huh.
it might still like diminish the spiritual reward.
Oh, I see.
So, for example, some scholars say shaving your beard during Ramadan. Uh-huh.
Might lessen the spiritual benefit even though it doesn't technically break the fast.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're still fulfilling the obligation,
Right.
but you're not getting the full, spiritual oomph out of it.
Okay.
And there's also a really important exception we should mention.
What's that?
During Dhul Hijjah, which is the month of the Hajj pilgrimage,
Uh-huh.
for those who are intending to perform Qurbani, the sacrifice,
Okay.
the Hanbali school of Islamic law actually considers cutting hair and nails during that time to be forbidden.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And even for other schools of thought, it's highly recommended to refrain from cutting your hair or nails
Okay.
because it's seen as like echoing this state of Ihram.
Which is when the pilgrims are.
Yeah, they're in that sacred state.
Right,
They're,
I
they're not,
understood.
cutting their hair or nails and things like that.
Interesting. So it's like a way of
Showing solidarity.
Yeah, like you're with them in spirit. Exactly. And I think it's worth mentioning here that Islamic teachings in general, they place a lot of emphasis on like natural appearances, especially for men.
Right.
They discourage like excessive adornment or imitating other cultures. And there are even specific rules about certain hairstyles, like the Qazaz hairstyle,
Which is
the one where they shave the sides of their head
Right.
and leave a little bit on top.
Yeah.
And that's actually considered forbidden for men in Islam.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and for women, the guidelines tend to focus more on like, adorning themselves for their husbands or making sure their hair is easy to care for, things like that.
So there's like a practicality element to it as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And when it comes to like voluntary fasts that people might do outside of Ramadan, the same guidelines generally apply.
Okay, so pretty much consistent across the board.
Yeah, you want to check with your local scholar or imam to be sure,
Of course.
but generally those are the guidelines.
That's really interesting. And, it's funny because I've heard some people say that, like, in their culture, they were told that if you get a haircut, you have to fast for a certain number of days afterwards.
Oh, yeah.
But it sounds like that's not really...
Not based in the core teachings,
Yeah, it's like a
cultural
cultural thing.
belief.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting how these things can get
Passed down.
passed down and kind of mixed in with the actual religious teachings.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to think about, like, historically in some Muslim cultures, women have been encouraged to have, like, long hair.
Right.
And so maybe that also plays into some of these cultural beliefs
Yeah, definitely.
about haircuts and fasting.
Could be.
That's fascinating.
But it's important to remember that cleanliness and hygiene are really important in Islam.
Even while fasting.
Even while fasting, yeah.
So things like showering, using perfume,
Painting your nails.
trimming your pubic hair.
All of that's generally considered permissible. Yeah, because it's part of fitra, which is like the natural disposition.
Oh, I see.
So it's all about keeping yourself clean and pure even while you're abstaining from food and drink.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right, so that's Islam.
What about Christianity?
Let's move on to Christianity. What do they have to say about all this?
Okay, so Christianity is interesting because they have such a wide range of fasting practices.
That's true.
You know, you've got everything from just abstaining from certain foods
Right.
to like partial fasts where you eat only certain things at certain times.
Uh-huh.
And then you've got Lent, which is a really significant period of fasting for many Christians.
Right, 40 days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But across the board, the emphasis in Christian fasting is really on the spiritual purpose.
Okay.
It's about deepening your relationship with God, focusing on prayer repentance, things like that.
So it's more about the inner transformation
Exactly.
than the outward.
Right. And there's a really key biblical passage that a lot of people point to. It's in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus is talking about fasting.
Uh-huh.
And he actually says, you know, when you fast, don't look all gloomy like the hypocrites do.
Oh, wow.
They neglect their appearance to show people they're fasting.
Right.
But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face.
Yeah. So he's saying like,
Don't make a big show of it.
yeah, keep up your normal hygiene.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Maintain a normal appearance.
Okay, so based on that, it sounds like getting a haircut.
Would be totally fine.
Yeah.
Because it contributes to that like normal, presentable appearance.
Right.
You're not trying to show off your piety through your unkempt hair.
It's about the internal. Yeah.
Exactly. And across different Christian denominations, there isn't really a general prohibition against getting haircuts during fasting.
Okay, so even in denominations that have like specific rules about women's hair,
Right.
like some Pentecostal denominations,
Yeah.
those rules aren't usually tied to fasting specifically?
Right. They're more about like general modesty and things like that. Now, historically, you did have some ascetic Christian groups that would practice really extreme self-denial.
Okay.
And they might have like neglected their grooming as part of that,
Wow.
but that was not like the norm.
Right, it was like a very
That's
specific.
a very fringe thing.
Okay.
And it wasn't really tied to like the standard guidelines for fasting.
Okay, so the main takeaway here is,
Focus on the spiritual,
yeah,
not the external.
awesome. All right, let's move on to Judaism.
All right.
So they have a pretty structured system of fast days, right?
They do, yeah.
So how does that affect the whole haircut situation?
This is where it gets a little more complex.
Okay.
So in Judaism, you have major fasts like Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av,
Uh-huh.
and those come with a lot of prohibitions beyond just food and drink,
Like what?
like washing and anointing the body.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so based on that, most rabbis would say that haircuts would probably also be refrained from during those major fasts.
Okay, because they're kind of in the same category.
Right. It's all about like denying yourself physical pleasure
Right.
and kind of focusing on the spiritual.
Gotcha.
But then you have minor fasts like Sum Gedolia, Asara, B'Tivs, things like that.
Yeah.
And those generally have fewer restrictions.
Okay.
So getting a haircut during those minor fasts is usually considered acceptable.
Okay, so it really depends on...
The severity of the fast.
Yeah.
Now, there are also fasts that specifically commemorate the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem,
Okay.
and those are generally considered to be times when you wouldn't get a haircut.
Because it's like a period of mourning.
Exactly.
Okay.
But even within those, there's an interesting exception.
Oh, there is.
Yeah, the fast of Esther, Tayanis Esther,
Uh-huh.
that one actually explicitly permits bathing and haircuts.
For everyone.
For everyone, yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah, it's like a little pocket of leniency
Yeah.
in the midst of all these restrictions.
And why is that?
There are different interpretations, but one thought is that because the fast of Esther is connected to a story of like hidden identity,
Uh-huh.
it's seen as appropriate to kind of like,
Maintain your appearance?
yeah, maintain your appearance, even enhance it a little bit.
Fascinating.
And then you've got mourning periods like the Omer and the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av,
Yeah.
where there are prohibitions against getting haircuts.
Okay.
So if a fast falls within one of those periods,
Uh-huh.
then the haircut prohibition would also apply.
I see.
It can get complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And within Jewish law, halacha,
Uh-huh.
there are different opinions about all this.
Okay.
Some rabbis advocate for being stricter
Okay.
and saying that anything that's forbidden during the 9 days leading up to Tisha B'Av should also be forbidden on any fast day that falls within that period.
I see.
But others, like Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg,
Yeah.
he disagreed with that.
He said what?
He said that haircuts aren't really about like bodily enjoyment,
Really?
which is the main reason why things are forbidden on fast days.
I see.
So he didn't see a reason to extend the prohibition.
Interesting.
So the prevailing halacha seems to be that haircuts are generally permissible on most fast days,
Okay.
but being stricter is often seen as like a praiseworthy thing.
I see.
And Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, he actually drew a distinction between Tanis Esther and the other fasts,
Uh-huh.
saying that the leniency surrounding Tanis Esther is unique
Okay.
and shouldn't be applied to other fasts.
So there's a lot of debate.
And nuance.
Yeah.
And it's also worth noting that there's a general prohibition for men in Judaism against shaving their beards with a razor.
Right. I've heard of that.
But that's not specific to fasting.
Right. It's just a general rule.
Yeah.
So it's a whole other...
Rabbit hole
Yeah.
we could go down.
Maybe another deep dive.
Exactly.
All right. So we've got Islam, Christianity, Judaism,
What about Hinduism?
Hinduism. Yeah. Let's talk about Hinduism and their Vrata practices.
Okay, so in Hinduism, they have a ton of different fasting practices called vratas,
Right.
and they're usually connected to specific deities or festivals,
Like what?
like Navratri, Shivratri, Ekadashi, Shravan Mas.
Lots of different ones.
Yeah, tons of different ones.
Okay.
And during some of these fasting periods, particularly Navratri and Shravan Mas, there's a pretty strong trend towards discouraging haircuts and shaving.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, there are a few different reasons.
Okay.
One is the belief that cutting your hair releases energy.
Okay.
And during fasting, you're trying to conserve your energy.
Right. Focus it inward.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's also seen as a way of promoting inner cleansing and purification.
I see.
Like you're shedding the old
Right.
along with the hair.
Interesting.
And there's also an element of showing respect.
Okay.
Like during Navratri, people are fasting in honor of Muldurga.
Uh-huh.
And it's seen as a sign of respect to refrain from cutting your hair during that time.
I see.
It's like you're making a sacrifice. Yeah.
As part of your devotion.
Okay.
And then there's also the idea of self-discipline.
Uh-huh.
Fasting is all about controlling your desires.
Right.
And so refraining from something like a haircut is seen as like another way of exercising that self-control.
Okay.
And some people also believe that cutting your hair during certain times can make you more susceptible to negative energies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So it's kind of like a protective measure.
Okay.
Now, the specific restrictions can vary depending on the particular vow that someone has taken.
Okay.
Like during Navratri, some people might observe a really strict fast called Navratri Diksha,
Uh-huh.
and they might have even stricter rules about haircuts and other things.
I see.
But in general, there are a lot of Hindus who avoid cutting their hair on Tuesdays, Fridays, and Sundays.
Just in general.
Yeah, just as a general practice.
Wow. Okay.
And it's all tied into this idea of maintaining a sattvic lifestyle,
Which means?
which means like living in a way that promotes purity, balance, and harmony.
So during fasting, it's not just about the food you eat. It's also about avoiding tamasic activities.
Tamasic meaning.
Tamasic meaning like things that are disruptive or chaotic or that disturb your inner peace.
Okay.
So cutting your hair might fall into that category for some people.
Interesting. So it's a really holistic
It's
approach.
very holistic.
Yeah.
It's about aligning your inner and outer world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've got one more faith to talk about,
Buddhism.
Buddhism.
Oh.
So what's their take on all this?
So Buddhism is a little different
Okay.
because fasting practices vary quite a bit.
Right.
It's not like a central pillar of the faith in the same way that it is in some other religions.
Okay.
But for monks, it's pretty common to not eat solid food after noon.
Right.
And lay Buddhists might choose to do more intensive fasting on Uposatha days.
Which are?
They're kind of like Buddhist observance days,
Okay.
where people take on 8 precepts, including not eating after noon. But when it comes to haircuts during fasting, the Buddhist texts don't really say anything specific about it for lay practitioners.
So there's no like hard and fast rule?
Not really.
Okay.
Now, of course, monks shave their heads.
Right.
But that's more about renouncing worldly attachments.
Right.
It's not specifically tied to fasting.
Gotcha.
And for lay Buddhists, they generally have a lot of freedom when it comes to their hair.
Okay.
You know, there are no like strict rules about length or style.
So it's related to the individual.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And I think this ties back to the core Buddhist emphasis on inner discipline and mindfulness.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's not so much about outward appearances.
Right.
It's about cultivating a clear and focused mind
Okay.
and detachment from material things.
So if a lay Buddhist wanted to get a haircut during a fast,
It wouldn't really be a problem.
Okay.
The 8 precepts that people observe on Uposatha days don't mention anything about haircuts.
So it seems like Buddhism is pretty permissive
Yeah.
when it comes to this. Right, so we've looked at 5 different faiths.
5 different perspectives.
What's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think it's fascinating to see how each religion approaches this question.
Yeah.
You know, in Islam and Christianity, it's generally considered okay to get a haircut while fasting.
Right.
Although there are some specific exceptions we talked about, in Judaism, it's a lot more nuanced.
Yeah, it depends on the fast
Exactly.
and the interpretations.
Right.
And in Hinduism, it's often discouraged during certain fasting periods.
Yeah. Especially if those periods are connected to certain deities or festivals.
Right.
And then Buddhism seems to be the most permissive
Yeah.
for lay practitioners, at least.
Yeah.
So there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right. It really depends on the faith.
And the individual.
Exactly.
And it's always a good idea to, consult with a religious leader or scholar from your tradition if you have specific questions.
Right. Always good to get that personalized guidance.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
I think it's so interesting to see how even something like a haircut,
Right.
which seems so mundane,
Yeah.
can take on all these different layers of meaning.
Yeah.
When you look at it through the lens of different faiths,
Totally.
it makes you think about, all the little things in our lives
Yeah.
and how they might be connected to our spirituality in ways that we don't even realize.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been fun.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah.
All right, that's all for today, folks.
See you next time.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.